Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. A national day of mourning today to remember President George H.W. Bush, the 41st Commander-in-Chief of the United States. A state funeral held at the National Cathedral in Washington today, and now the former president's body has just landed in Texas. We want to take you live to Texas and Houston, where Elizabeth Herr joins us now with the very latest. Elizabeth?
Just about an hour from now, Houstonians will get to pay their final respects to a man family and friends say was a perfect American and president who loved his community and country. President George Herbert Walker Bush taking his final flight home. The Bush family returning to Houston with their patriarch following a state funeral in Washington.
He left us a more perfect union.
And touching eulogies from friends answering the one question that haunted Bush 41 his entire life after surviving being shot down during World War II.
Made our lives and the lives of nations freer, better, warmer, and nobler. That's why him. That's why he was spared.
The cathedral packed with political leaders from across the country and around the world, including all living U.S. presidents coming together to honor Bush for his decency, his humor.
He loved a good joke, but he never, ever could remember a punchline.
His commitment to his service and devotion to his family.
And the last words he would ever say on earth were, "I love you too."
Former president and son George W. Bush delivering the final eulogy, breaking down, calling his late father a great and noble man and the best father.
And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again.
The Bush family is extremely popular here in Texas, their adopted home state, and so public viewing hours here at the family's church, they will last about 12 hours until 6 tomorrow morning. Live in Houston, I'm Elizabeth Herr, ABC News. Back to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we're going to spend the majority of this hour remembering President Bush. And joining us now, senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman. And Andrew, we are looking at live pictures right now. The president touching ground, both the extended family, obviously, in Houston, Texas. Moving ceremony today, and then, as we mentioned, he will lie in repose, and then there'll be a service tomorrow for the president, and then he will be buried in Texas. But today, it was notable. You had the historian, and we'll be playing sound for those folks who didn't get to see it earlier today, John Meacham, going over his life's legacy and the signposts in his life that stood out from his early days as a young flyer till the end, and always the notable moments in between. You had actually Senator Simpson with some comedic relief here talking about how the president was there for him even when he was not exactly the most popular person on Capitol Hill. And then you also heard Mulrooney talking about his role on the international stage. And then finally his son, as we just showed a brief clip, and we'll show an extended one this hour, talking about him both as a president and as a father, and held it together up until just about the very end. But I thought it was a really moving ceremony. And then, of course, you had the optics of, past and current president all sharing the same row.
And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, later on in the hour. I thought that the President Bush's eulogy of his father was remarkably touching, a very human speech, reminding you of the man from the perspective of somebody who knew him well, both as a mentor, as his son, and somebody who was mentored by him, but also somebody who followed his lessons into the White House and used him as a touchstone for his own administration. I got touched, I got a little emotional seeing James Baker, who was his Secretary of State, his right-hand man, a close ally.
His
first campaign manager. And Bush Sr., in some ways, saved Baker. Baker, after the death of his wife, was adrift, didn't know what to do. And Bush asked him to run his campaign. And that loyalty that they carried together.
And Baker said, I was apolitical. I forget about running a campaign, didn't know anything about it. But the president, and then at the time, just a Texan said, what do I know either? Let's do it together. And it was the start of a 50-plus year friendship. And he'll be speaking tomorrow at the service in Texas.
My other takeaway from the service today had less to do with President Bush, the man, or with the families. It was about the nation itself and how almost necessary a day like today was for this nation, as divided as we are politically, as much as the norms of Washington have been smashed with our current politics, but also by voters and citizens who are frustrated with the way things are going and wonder, can government work and what should its role be? To see the norms back in place, the traditions and respect for the office and the people who have held that office, to remind people that this is what it used to be and could be again, and to have that put in front of us again, a moment where we can come together from all sides of the aisle, find common ground, and realize that there is less that divides us. I thought it was an important day for the nation's psyche, and I hope it gets attention from that level.
And you and I certainly have taken a lot of issues with some of the policies that Bush 41 took.
Sure.
And he was not averse to running his own difficult campaign. Just look up Willie Horton if you want an example of but no one ever questioned a lifelong service to country. The one thing that was never for debate was George Herbert Walker Bush, without any scintilla of question, put his country before himself. He believed in service to country. He didn't think it was a catchphrase. It was said today. He never hated anyone. I believe it. If you look at Bill Clinton, beat him in a bitter campaign. Mm-hmm. In the latter years, Bill Clinton and George Bush raised nearly $1 billion for relief aid for people in this world that were stricken by either hurricane or earthquake or tsunami. Bill Clinton, they described their friendship. Someone said to him, how can you be friends with Clinton after what happened? He goes, I like the man, and we talk. And he goes, you talk? He goes, well, Bill talks 90% of the time, and I listen. But Bill never really had a father, so that's my role. James Baker, as you mentioned, after losing his wife to a bitter battle with cancer and being completely adrift, he always looked from then till the day he died to President Bush as his big brother. You saw George Bush, who was, yes, he was his father, as was Jeb and his siblings as well, but that was complicated. But he said, my father never offered me guidance in the White House. My father just said, I love you. And there you see James Baker, as you alluded to earlier, got choked up, and tomorrow he'll be speaking about his closest friend, and he spent, in the waning years, more time than just about anyone with now the late president.
There's no question, and I've not heard anybody in the days since we lost the former president question George Bush's patriotism. You knew at the core of everything, whether you disagreed with his decisions or his policies, that he felt he was doing it because he felt it was in the best interest of the country. And there's something admirable about that, and again, something that I think we took for granted for some time. In fact, there was only one policy, only one time in his career as president, where it was obvious that he was taking a position for political gain that wasn't something that he held dear to his heart. And that was the Reaganomics, the supply-side economics of the 1980s.
He called it voodoo economics.
Called it voodoo economics in 1980 as a candidate running against Ronald Reagan. But as his vice president, he had to embrace it, and running for his own term in 88, he again embraced it and stuck with it. And you knew in his heart of hearts that he didn't necessarily agree with it, but that it was the right move politically.
And just on that, obviously, what I found one of the more courageous acts that he did, maybe bad politics, but to your point, he acknowledged that Desert Storm came with an economic cost, and all this expense needed a certain little thing, as Simpson called revenue.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to have to go against my pledge. It'll be a gut punch, but I guess I got to do it.
But the irony is that arguably that and just the overall state of the economy cost him the office in 1992.
Because he raised taxes.
Right. The other thing is the lesson that his son and the current Republican president and other presidents since then have learned from George H.W. Bush is that you cannot make that promise and then break it. So there have been more ideological conservatives in the White House who would never make a decision like the one that George H.W. Bush made in 91 to pay for all of that. And that's, you could argue, to the benefit of them politically, W and Trump, but to the harm of the nation. in the overall, because you do need a president who's willing to contradict himself if he thinks that's what the moment calls for.
There were so many, and I think you said it right. It was an important moment to remember. And I'm not trying to put some halcyon gauze on where it was then and now, but he wasn't an angry person. And we live in such angry times. But think about some of the things that he did and that people trusted him he'd do. And imagine in today's day and age doing that. So the Berlin Wall comes down. You have Kohl, then the chancellor in Germany, wondering what the heck's going to happen. Mm-hmm. The president says, I'll be there for you. He didn't spike the football when it came down. The same thing with the fall of Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev trusted him that the U.S. wasn't going to try and take political or military hay to plant some flag over there. He said, I will stay silent, which in itself. Do you imagine in today's climate, especially in a certain White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, that not happening? And now we're seeing the casket being released, coming off the plane as it makes its final journey. And to that, Andrew, he understood we were part of this world. Now, part of it was an experience. I mean, yes, he was the youngest naval aviator that we had, and a decorated one with a Distinguished Cross. He was a congressman. He was also an oil executive in the private sector, so you knew of that. He was ambassador to UN. He was the envoy to China. He was the head of the RNC, so he knew the political world. He obviously was the head of the CIA at one point. Then he became obviously a vice president. And also eventually president. So he came more prepared than anyone I can think of, but he understood the world isn't closed off by your borders. And we'll talk later, but look at the Saudi Arabia situation for a minute. Do you imagine that? Do you imagine him abetting person after person getting indicted in his office? The idea that he'd do something to maybe self-profit from an enemy of the United States as a way to line his potential coffers. Those were so inconceivable to this man. It's almost like we are forgetting a different generation, a different planet.
It's part of a fascinating biography of George H.W. Bush, because he was a congressman in Texas, and he was encouraged to run for the Senate a couple of times. And if he had won those, his career would have been much different. He kept losing. He lost to Lloyd Bentsen at one point. He was the head of the RNC during Watergate, which was really carrying water for the party. I mean, terrible time to be the head of the RNC. But because of that, he was able to get appointments to positions like the CIA or the envoy to China and burnish his resume and his reputation and learn those skills and become more of the global thinker that we now think of when we think back on President Bush. He learned those skills mostly in the 70s in those appointed positions. But that history and that context, noting that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't a 1991 story. It was a 50-year story. Yeah. And that the lessons of the previous 50 years played into that moment. And so he knew that it wasn't, as you said, the time to spike the football or to seek advantage. I mean, we wound up sending billions of dollars to the former Soviet Union because we realized, A, if they collapsed, that would harm the entire world, and B, that if they were able to avoid some of the economic pain that everybody thought that they were going to, there'd be new consumers, new customers, new partners for us to trade with to the world's benefit. And it was the right call to make at the time.
He understood that a stable world was a good one, that the idea of not having losers in certain places and winners in others, the more stable it was, as the world's policeman, the more it was in our self-interest. And to say that is not necessarily being absorbed right now is to be maybe making the biggest understatement. We're seeing, obviously, I'm sorry, just the first family exiting the plane there.
It's a large family.
It is. And you saw some of the people that may not have been familiar before today, but the grandchildren who delivered readings and also extended family. And then you saw some of the participants from today. You can even see John Meacham there in the distance, the historian who wrote the biography, the definitive one on George Bush, who was also there. I mean, so many stories. We saw James Baker exiting earlier as we were talking. His closest friend, again, will have a role tomorrow, is an adopted home of Texas. For those watching us, in the Northeast, a lot of local ties from both George Bush and his late wife Barbara to our area, from both Westchester in New York and Connecticut. right across the border in the Greenwich area. He grew up a child of privilege, did George Bush. He went to Andover, the son of a senator.
From Connecticut.
Absolutely. And he was slated to go right to Yale, right out of it. Then came Pearl Harbor, of which, by the way, the 75th anniversary coming up this Friday, and 77th, excuse me. And he deferred going, and he went right instead into the Navy. And we talked about 50 some odd combat missions, and then that fateful flight where he had his two crewmates parachute out first, and he, before this plane crashed, being the final to exit, he was the only one who survived. He carried that survivor's guilt with him, and it drove so many of his life decisions, as you heard today from the eulogies, and dedicated himself to a life of sacrifice. And
we've not had a president with military experience since George H.W. Bush, and certainly not one who has war experience and a war veteran.
And no matter what, it'll be the last president we ever have from the greatest generation.
He certainly will be. He certainly will be. And it makes you wonder, how long will it be? Will we see another president with military experience? Just because that doesn't seem to be anywhere near as large a role in the country, in our society, as it had been. And how does that change us as a nation? Does that make us more impulsive, more willing to go to war or to burnish our military might more quickly?
And there you see George Bush, George W. Bush, President 43, who, it's interesting. A lot of former presidents have really distinguished themselves in their post-presidential career. And he never took a shot, did this president, at his successor. It's been no secret he's been no fan of the current president, given the caustic campaign that Trump ran in targeting his brother. There you see Jeb Bush right behind the president. But this president, and maybe from the direction of his late father, took the high road. And unlike at Barbara Bush, reportedly at her insistence, she did not want Donald Trump at her funeral. George Bush 41 did. And his presidential son went out of his way to both extend a hand to him today. The president, to be fair, President Bush, for the better part of this week, both extended Air Force One to the Bush family, and they have been conciliatory, meeting at the Blair House as well. We'll get into it later this hour, but it was really, to say an awkward scene would be putting it politely. But nonetheless, I think he really distinguished himself, Andrew, because he was, as you said, so human today.
Yeah.
And, he talked about his father as a father. And for all of us who know those complicated relationships with fathers and sons and the different stages and trying to both measure and then appreciate and then being a friend at the end, you could see it play out in many ways in his speech that was heartfelt.
The two Bushes clearly respect for the office, respect for the officers, the people who have served there. And notable that George H.W. Bush, even in his passing, not only didn't not invite the current president, wanted him there, wanted President Trump there. Maybe there was a teaching moment, maybe there's just respect for the office, and maybe he hoped that some of it would rub off on Trump, whatever his rationale was. I think that gives you some insight into the level of respect that he has for the office, and certainly that's something that we've seen echoed from his son. And you also touched on it too. We're both lucky enough to still have our fathers with us.
Yep.
I know your father fairly well. I can only imagine the pride of the late President Bush on seeing his son elected to the office, or the feeling from President George W. Bush talking with his father after winning that office.
Well, the final words of the late President Bush, as we see his casket being removed from Air Force One, was to his son, Bush 43, who said, I love you, Dad, and I love you too. And it was notable to me, I think, in that the moments that have been said that have meant the most to George W. Bush is when his father put his hand on after he delivered his speech. And let's listen right now to the scene live in Houston. And now you see the extended Bush family and friends as they will make their way via the motorcade to the ceremony designated for tonight. Will, of course, stay with us. All right, we're going to take our first break of the night, and when we come back, we're going to talk a lot more about what happened today, as well as also not just remembering the man, but also some of the surreal moments and also uplifting ones that we saw today. But as we go out to break, here, the man you just saw, President George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, eulogizing his father.
When the history books are written, they will say that George H.W. Bush was a great President of the United States, a diplomat of unmatched skill, a commander-in-chief of formidable accomplishment, and a gentleman who executed the duties of his office with dignity and honor.